Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Surprised by Love. Chapter 1. Bright orange colored the horizon, marking a new day for Margaret Palmer. The young bride was hard at work sweeping the dust from the porch. The cool breeze ticked her arms with every stroke as it caressed her dusty cheeks and played with her auburn hair. Even the wind seemed to celebrate the peace that still existed in Lawton, Nebraska, a peace that had been shattered by the war in other parts of the nation, including Margaret's hometown. She stopped her work to revel in the quiet. Virginia seemed so far away now, a lifetime ago. Margaret? I'm out here, Joe. Joseph Palmer was a man 15 years her senior, tall and muscled from working the land his entire life. He was a quiet man, no doubt from his years of solitude. Despite being only 37, his hair was salt and pepper. Even the shadow of whiskers that darkened his jaw held bits of gray, belying an otherwise youthful face. His appearance was deepened by the intensity of his dark eyes that seemed to look through her more than at her as he filled the doorframe. You're up early. Wasn't feelin' very well. Couldn't get back to sleep, so I decided to get started. No better time than the present. That's right. He jammed his hands into his pockets as he stepped out on the porch, his unwavering eyes still set on her as he moved closer. He reached up to hold her chin gently as he turned her face from side to side. You look tired. You sure you're all right? Maybe you should take it easy. I'm fine, Joe. Just been a long few days, and it's wearin' on me. She dismissed his concern with a polite smile. Really? If you're sure. His calloused hand released her face, falling loosely to his side. Did you eat? Not yet. I made you something and just wanted to be outside. You do like the outdoors better than bein' in the house, he commented. I best get goin' soon, but before I do, there's something we need to talk about. Her heart sank and her brow furrowed, though she quickly smoothed it with a quick calming breath. One thing and one thing alone had occupied her husband's mind since she'd become his mail-order bride a year before. Had the day she dreaded finally come? Joseph's arms folded over his chest, his eyes occupying themselves with the planks on the porch as he began to speak. I've made a decision. She braced herself. So you're going, then? He nodded, his eyes rising to meet hers. It's the best way I can see to do what I need to for the ranch. Hearing the words spoken didn't come as a surprise, she'd expected them, though she'd hoped that something would happen to change his mind. But Joseph was determined. He'd worked the land with his father since he was a boy, and when he'd grown old enough to stake a claim for himself, he'd done it. He'd spent 11 years trying to build something that didn't seem to be getting where he wanted it to be. He was sure that this new venture was the way to expand his herd and move away from farming into full-time ranching. It was a more lucrative venture, albeit a more expensive one to get off the ground. When you thinkin' of leavin'? In a week or so. I need to get some things together first. I'll be gone fair a month or so. Maybe more. Should be long enough to find a claim. A month or more, she questioned, trying to hide her apprehension. Yep. Don't worry. I'll get someone to help round here while I'm gone. I won't leave you with everything on your shoulders. I can do it, Margaret said quickly. She might have been nervous about managing their ranch on her own, even though they only had a few head of cattle, but the idea of someone else there who wasn't Joseph was even more unsettling. I'll get someone from town. Sure, I can find someone who'll fit. Someone with experience herding cattle. She nodded silently. He was right. She didn't have the slightest clue what to do. Hiring someone was the most logical thing, and Joseph was nothing if not logical. He always had a plan, and when that failed, another one to fall back on. When will you start lookin'? I was thinkin' goin' into town today. You've thought everything out, haven't ya? She squeezed the handle of the broom, wishing their relationship was different. Joseph wasn't big on expressing his affection, and because of that, she was hesitant to express hers. In truth, she didn't know how he felt about her. If you aren't feelin' well, I can stay roon here and go to town tomorrow. I said I'm fine, Joe, she reiterated, once again putting the broom to work as she turned away from him. She could hear his exhalation behind her, but she didn't turn around. Yes, he was older than she was, but she wasn't incapable. At least, not anymore. She'd been working by his side for the better part of a year. Hadn't she proved her merit time and time again? I'll see a fair supper then. All right, she answered, her back still to him until she heard the sound of his footsteps disappear, then she turned to look where he'd been. Her stomach was in knots. Joseph was leaving. The call of gold in Colorado had stolen his ear, and there was no swaying him. Lord, let this work out fair the best, she whispered, just in case she was heard. The day of Joseph's leaving was at hand. She didn't want him to go, but she'd never say so. They didn't do that, speak their hearts to each other. But Joseph's announcement had stolen her peace. He was the only family she had now, and he'd be leaving soon. Barely a year married, and she was to be left on her own. Father, help me through this. I need you. You didn't leave me in Virginia. You didn't leave me in Kentucky. I know you won't leave me now. Give me strength. Chapter 2. The nightmares were back. Margaret had done her best to hide them from Joseph, but she knew he sensed something was wrong. He acted as if she were more fragile than she was, hovering around asking her if she was all right. She was doing her best to keep things together, to keep her mind focused on what lay before her, a month or more on her own. She was quieter than usual, and because of it, the house was uncomfortably silent. She never realized how much her own voice filled the house on a daily basis, and how little Joseph had to say without her encouragement. It had taken months to establish a routine when she'd arrived on the train. Joseph was so used to being alone that he'd found communicating difficult. On paper, he was a master of his feelings. In person, he was as silent as midnight. "You're still feelin' tired?" he asked, as he devoured a mouthful of ham and looked across his plate of biscuits. He was watching her carefully, as he always did. She often wondered why. Was it because of what had happened? Because of the horror in her past that he felt he needed to keep a constant eye on her? It was even more reason to keep the nightmares from him. A little. "There's been a lot to do with you leavin' and all. I didn't ask you to do more, Margaret. Just do what you've always done. I found a man to help you. He's comin' up today." "Today?" she asked, plating another portion of ham onto his plate. Joseph liked ham. She always made double for him. "I told him to come up late in the mornin', give you a chance to get your chores out the way so you could be there to help me show him round the place. Give you a chance to get to know him. He seems a good feller. Came highly recommended. Had letters to prove it." His words brought her no comfort. "That's wonderful. I'm sure he'll be a real help. I wanted to make things easier on ya." There was a gentleness to Joseph's tone, one she hadn't heard before. "I know," she stated, sliding into the seat across from him. A small smile lifted her mouth. She'd come to care a great deal for Joseph. His sometimes stiff kindness was touching. She was going to miss it when he was gone. She'd grown accustomed to his care and concern, even if sometimes it felt as if he saw her more as a child than a woman. "Eat up. It's good." He gave her a crooked smile. "I hear the cook room here's pretty good." "I agree." The morning passed quickly as Margaret tried her best to occupy her mind. She collected the eggs, washed the vegetables Joseph harvested and left a few to add to the lunch she'd be preparing later. Then she moved to Joseph's shirts. Unlike some women in Lawton, who frequented Mrs. Wilson's establishment for their garments, Margaret was skilled with a needle and thread and only ventured into town for fabric and new needles when she needed them. Even the dress she'd married Joseph in was made by her own hand. She'd been encouraged by some of the ladies in town to open a shop, but Margaret didn't like the city. She liked the quiet of her homestead, free from prying questions. She'd had enough of those in Kentucky. Margaret worked on a new pair of pants, with the gray material draped across her knees and pins sticking out in intervals to keep the front and back together as she sat at the treadle machine. The sewing machine was a gift from Joseph when she'd arrived in Lawton City, his way of welcoming her to her new home. It was the first sign of how caring he could be, even if that was all there was between them. Still, friendship in marriage was to be envied. There was something mesmerizing in watching the needle go in and out, each stitch carefully perfected and measured as the machine's teeth drew the fabric in and then away from her. It gave her a sense of calm. "Margaret?" Joseph's voice called from the porch, silencing the machine. "Yes?" "Come on out here," he continued as the door swung open. He was smiling. "Someone I want you to meet." She watched him silently, her heart wanting to stay at her sewing machine. Something was eating at her insides, but she didn't know what. She forced herself to ignore it and follow Joseph's voice outside. The man standing before her was tall, only a few inches shorter than her husband, but not as brawny. He didn't wear suspenders, something she found strange. She'd never seen Joseph at work without his suspenders. They were a real help in keeping up his trousers with all the bending and lifting he did. Then there were the man's eyes. They were shifty and wouldn't settle on her face as Joseph introduced them. "Randall Green, this is my wife, Margaret. Margaret, this is Randall. He's gonna help you while I'm gone." "Nice to meet you, ma'am," Randall said, stepping toward her with an outstretched hand and a practiced grin. She didn't smile back. "Mr. Green," she replied, taking his hand politely and quickly releasing it. "My husband says you come highly recommended." "Yes, ma'am. I've worked on some large ranches in Texas." "What brought you out here?" she questioned, unable to shake her disquiet. Her arms folded over her middle as she watched him. His eyes refused to be still. "Just needed a change. Thought I might find something better out here." Joseph patted his back. "Well, you found a place with us now. I'm gonna need a good man round here when I get back ready to add to the herd." "I'm your man." "How many heads you said you have now?" 30. "How many you plannin' on adding to it?" "As many as I can get and handle with just the two of us. Maybe another 50 or so, at least to start." "Sounds like a good plan, and once things go well, you could always look at a couple more hands and a few more head of cattle." Margaret listened in silence. Joseph sounded so excited as he and Randall talked about the plans for the ranch. How could she tell him that something wasn't right? Something inside her was telling her not to trust the man he hired, but she had no reason for it. There was just something there that she couldn't put her finger on, a feeling she'd experienced before, right before the soldiers arrived on the farm and changed her life forever. There was only one word to describe it: foreboding. Chapter 3. The sun was ablaze above his head, scorching the back of his neck, though years working the land had long made his skin impervious to its sting. Sweat drenched the back of his shirt, while water soaked the folds in his rolled-up sleeves. His feet were weary, but there was no stopping. The day was only half gone, and as long as there was enough light, there was work to do. "Where you from, stranger?" a cracked voice called from beside him. The man was older, twice Joseph's age or more, with a long beard that met the top of his thin belly, and a hole where one of his front teeth should have been. His face was creased and weather-worn, clearly, a man who'd lived his life under the sun, but it was the gold that glinted in the light that told the whole story. "Lawton City, Nebraska," Joseph replied, steadily pouring water through the rocker he'd erected along a strip of unoccupied riverbank, not that there was much to be found. The prospect of gold had brought men from every corner of the country to Colorado for the same purpose that had brought him: dreams of wealth. Stories of gold's abundance, and the men who'd found their fortunes buried along some frolicking shore had stung the ears of many a man, all of them with an ardent desire for wealth in their hearts that only the other hopefuls could understand. Joseph wondered what pursuit had brought his toothless comrade. "What's your name, Nebraska?" the old-timer asked, swirling a pan of silt and stone. "Joseph." "Joe, eh?" "No. Joseph. You're a bit of a stickler, ain't ya? The man continued to question, silent sloshing water over his hand. No. Just nobody calls me Joe but my wife. Another married one. Ye hear that, Willie? He called to a man squatting a few feet away. I heard him, Earl. He smiled, turning his attention in Joseph's direction. I'm Willie. Willie Tanner. Nice to meet ya, Joseph. You got a last name? Palmer. Well, Joseph Palmer, welcome to the wealthiest place on earth, he chimed. The place where us men settle, leavin' wives and children, in my case. Fiancés and sweethearts, in the case of Albert, Theodore, and Reuben there, he continued, inclining his head in the direction of the other men who stood silently in their midst. Only Willie there's got no attachment. I've got an attachment, the surly old man replied, sloshing more silt upon his hand as he feverishly disturbed the mud and rock in the bottom of his pan. That's right, Earl corrected. Willie's only connection is to gold. Spent his whole life lookin' ferret. Found me some too. The hapless man laughed. Did ya? Sure did. 5 years ago, I found me a nice vein, 'bout 6 miles from here. Took it to town and sold me the lot for a tidy sum. What are you doing here, then? Joseph questioned, his mind stuck on the tale of the older man's success. Could such a man really have struck it rich and be in such a state? Gold don't last forever, you know, Nebraska. Comes slow, but goes quick. You're sayin' it's all gone? Joseph found that hard to believe. How could anyone find himself a wealth of gold and lose it all so quickly? It seemed impossible. Willie nestled his pan on his hip, a satisfied grin on his face. He looked to the sky as if the answer he was looking for was hidden amongst the cerulean blue. I enjoyed it. Got me new clothes, a new house, even a new tooth. His smile broadened. Found myself some women to spend it on, a different gal every month, long as they were entertainin'. Got invited to the best poker tables in Colorado. Lord, I enjoyed my money. Enjoyed it right out of your hand, Earl piped in. Just causing ye sent your little pieces to your wife and chillin' don't mean nothin' if you're not enjoyin' it. I don't need to enjoy it. I'm here for my family. It ain't easy with the war and all, and people is sufferin'. Sure, your wife is on her own like that. No husband to keep her company. Watch your tongue, Willie, Earl warned, his jovial expression gone. Don't be talkin' ill 'bout my wife. I'm just sayin', no woman lets her man just run off and leave her like that, lest she's got someone else lined up to keep her warm at night. Earl was on his feet in an instant. Joseph's muscles tensed, but the cause wasn't the sudden dark change in the atmosphere. It was Willie's words. Ever since the day he'd announced he'd be leaving, Joseph had wondered at Margaret's behavior. He'd approached her, expecting tears the morning he told her he had made the choice to leave. None came. Margaret even seemed a little ambivalent to his proclamation. Then there was the day he left. Still, not a tear. What kind of woman wasn't upset when her husband left her? Could Willie be right, that there was only one reason for such behavior? Take it easy there, Earl, Joseph interjected, shrugging off the unpleasant notion to dissipate the tension. He's just an old man. Old man, my left jaw. Willie retorted, slapping his broad-brimmed hat against his thin leg. Let him come. I'll lay, I'm flat. Joseph would have laughed at the comment if it hadn't been for the almost murderous look in Willie's eye. The man may have been old, but it was clear a fire was still burning inside him. Enough. Joseph's firm voice caused both men to turn in his direction. A man knows his wife. So stop this rubbish. Nonsense. You could never know anyone completely. Everyone's got a secret. That's why I never bothered with marriage. Tie yourself to someone who could change on ya. Dumb as a post, that is. The adamant response pierced Joseph's soul. Margaret had only been his wife for a year. Hardly time to say he knew her completely, and already he'd left her, without any complaint on her part. Could it be? Could there be something inside Margaret that he wasn't aware of, some secret in the nightmares that had plagued her ever since she arrived? Some meaning to the frequent looks he'd spied whenever Randall was around? That night on the hard dirt, the thought haunted him. He stared up at the inside of his tent and wondered. What was Margaret doing that night? Chapter 4. Nothing felt right since Joseph left. He'd said it would only be a month, but already with the passing of 7 days, his absence was felt. Nothing was as it should be. Meal times were strained, instead of the relaxed atmosphere she'd grown used to. Randall, for all the help he was hired to be, was more troublesome than helpful at times. He refused to do as she asked, dawdling on her requests until she had to repeat them. Then, there was the feeling she had. In the time since their meeting and the present, Margaret's nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right with the ranch hand had failed to dissipate. Now, he was situated on a bunk in her barn at night and herding the cattle by day. Her eyes strained to keep track of him even when her back was turned. One morning, as she prepared their morning meal, she sensed his presence behind her in the close confines of the kitchen. Every sound made the hair on her arms stand on end. She'd asked the Lord again why she felt this way, but there was no answer. Finally, she'd decided to ask him one more thing. Show me who he really is, God. Show me who he really is. Here you go, Margaret stated as she placed a plate of flapjacks and bacon on a plate before Randall. She moved down the table on the opposite side to sit. No matter how she tried, she couldn't bring herself to sit across from him. It was Joseph's seat he was sitting in, but he was a far cry from her husband. Joseph's silence had been endearing, and the few words he spoke a cherished thing. Randall's words only served to convince her that there was something amiss. His chatter caused her to miss her husband even more. I'm goin' to need you to dig up them tree roots in the backyard. I want to prepare the soil, and get a few more things growin' before Joe comes back. We need more for our own table, and there's the possibility of taking some to sell in town. I'm busy today, was Randall's gruff response, his eyes never looking up from his plate. Gotta take the cattle down a ways to better pasture. She paused. That's all well and good, but I need you to do this today. I've been asking you all week, and all week you've been busy. She cocked her head to one side, looking at him squarely. So are you going to do it today or not? Not. His reply wasn't entirely unexpected, but her tolerance of his indignations had grown thin. She set her fork aside. Randall, I understand that the herd is a big priority, but it ain't the only priority roon here. My husband hired you to help me, and if you aren't planning to, then you need not be here. So, what's it goin' to be? She braced herself for his response. Randall stuffed his mouth with the last piece of bacon, then looked at her squarely as he pushed up from the table. With all due respect, ma'am, you didn't hire me. So you can't fire me. Only Joe can do that, and he ain't here. She winced. No one called her husband Joe but her. Don't call him Joe. It's Joseph, she stated, getting to her feet. And if you ain't doin' what he hired you to do, then you bet I'll be firing you. Her hands fixed on her hips immediately. Randall smirked. Ma'am, I ain't goin' to nowhere, till I've done what I came to do. And what is that? Margaret huffed. Takin, care of the herd till Joe gets back. That's a full-time job, and unless you want to be out there doin' it yourself, I'd suggest you let me be. He dropped his napkin on his plate, turned on his heel, and left. Margaret was seething, but going up against a man twice her size wasn't a battle she was prepared to fight. Besides, he was doing a decent job with the herd, something she couldn't do. She didn't have much choice. He'd have to stay for now. She pushed up her sleeves and cleared the table. There was a lot to accomplish, and it appeared as if she was going to be the one to accomplish it. Tilling the ground was never something Margaret had occasion to do, even in Virginia. Her chores had been the washing and mending, not working the ground. Her father had done that, and then her uncle, and now Joseph. But if they could do it, she supposed she could. She shoved her sleeves up higher, and with a heave, she hoisted the hoe in the air and brought it down. The shock that reverberated through her arms made her drop the hoe immediately. The rock she'd struck poked its head out defiantly from beneath. Maybe I should start in a different spot. She walked around to another promising position, and once again made an attempt. This time success. She managed several more swings, her arms and back quickly aching. Soon after, there was a snag. The root was large, possibly from the nearby maple, and no matter how hard she whacked at it, it would budge. "Oh, come on," she complained, and stooped to take the offender in hand. She tugged and tugged, her teeth gritting as sweat trickled down her brow. "Come out," she complained, and then fell flat on her behind as her feet gave out beneath her. Still, she wasn't deterred. She wrestled with the root, tugging with all her might until her hands slipped and a shock of pain ran up her wrist. "Fine then, be stubborn," she argued, cradling her wrist with her other hand. Silly root could stay where it was, she had other things to do. 10 minutes later, she was in the barn with a bucket in hand and a strip of cloth around her wrist. She looked at the Holstein, and it looked back. "Now, I know you're not used to seeing me in here, but Joe's gone and I have to milk ya. I can see it ain't been done yet. So let's make it easy on each other." The cow lowed. She'd seen Joseph do this 100 times. She sat on the short stool near the udders, like he did. She placed the bucket underneath like he did. She bent low to get the right angle, just like he did. But the moment her hand gripped the udder, the cow gave such a yelp that she promptly toppled back in fright and fell flat on the ground. "You needs to warm your hands," Randall's voice appeared from her right. "I thought you'd left," Margaret countered. "Needed to get a few things," he replied coolly. "I'm off." She watched his back as he left her right where she'd fallen. She huffed. "If he knows so much, why don't he milk ya?" she complained. The cow looked at her and bellowed. "All right. I'll warm my hands." Chapter 5. Something was after them. It was too dark to see, but the sound of the breath close at their heels was enough to confirm that there was something there, something big. No matter how far they ran, the sound was ever behind them, accompanied by the sound of teeth nipping at their heels. Then there was something strange. A sound that didn't quite fit amidst the terror, yet was familiar. Still, Margaret raced toward her hope for escape. Joseph was somewhere in the dark ahead of her. "Wait for me," she called. "Joseph, please, wait. I need to go," he called back. "Hurry, Margaret. Hurry." "I can't." "You're too fast," she countered, breathless. "Wait for me." She was about to tumble. Exhaustion was wearing her down, but the sounds behind her kept her going. Then a strange sound broke the darkness, and repeated again and again, as Margaret struggled to awaken. Her eyes sprang open in the darkness, and she shot up in bed. She was panting, a shiver caused her skin to erupt into tiny bumps. The sound echoed again. It wasn't just something from her dream, it was real. The cattle. She jumped from her bed, the light of the moon barely enough to see by. There was something moving amongst the shadows near the corral. She squinted as she tried to see better. "What's going on out there?" she whispered. She peered harder into the darkness, straining to make sense of the shadows. There was someone out there, but who could it be at that hour? Fear told her to stay put, secure in the house, and hope that Randall would deal with it. The thought of him doing anything to help gave her pause. He didn't care about the ranch, just the cattle and his weekly pay. No, this was her home, and if anyone was going to defend it, it would have to be her. She slipped her arms into her coat and hurried out of the room, her boots loosely tied around her feet as she went out to investigate the intruder. She rounded the corner of the house, her steps crunching in the dried underbrush she'd asked Randall to clear 2 days before. The man was useless if it concerned anything other than cows. She could make him out now. It was a man, and he was opening the gate to the corral and leading one of the steers out. "Who goes there?" she called from a safe distance. The figure paused, turned, and then answered. "It's Randall, ma'am." "Randall? What on earth are you doing out here at this hour?" She pulled her coat tighter around her as she watched him carefully. The animals were actin' up. Thought I'd best check it out. What are you doin' with that steer? She asked. Her eyes fixed on the pointed horns of the large animal. They were almost fully grown, time to prepare him for sale and the slaughterhouse, she thought. This one's sick. I was goin' to quarantine it. Best way to protect the herd. Don't want to lose any of 'em. His words all seemed perfectly logical, but there was something in the tone of his voice which made her uncomfortable. He was lying. She was sure of it. The question was why. What was he really doing there? Were you plannin' on puttin' her? She folded her arms at her waist. It was a feeble attempt at strength, but anything was better than the gnawing feeling inside. How she wished Joseph were there. He'd know what to do. He'd take care of things, and her, like he always did. In the barn with me fair now. In the morning, I'll check the rest of 'em and make sure that the sickness hasn't spread. Again, his words were reasonable. Making perfect sense. But she didn't believe a word of it. Something was wrong, she was sure, and now she was determined to find out what. You take care of that steer, she stated. Then get yourself to bed. Don't worry, ma'am. I know what I'm doin'. Why were you up so late? You're usually in bed by 11. The hours she kept were none of his business. Why was he keeping an account? His attention to her was concerning. What interest had he in her comings and goings, and the hours of her sleep? And why was he really out there at that hour of the night with cattle in hand? The animal didn't seem unwell, but she knew too little of the subject to be sure of it. She rocked on her heels. Well, I best be gettin' inside. It's cold out here. Tend to that animal and get yourself to bed. It'll be light soon, and the day has plenty of work awaiting it. I'll get there. You best be off first. I'll follow in a while, Randall stated, his gaze firmly set on her. Margaret hesitated. The thought of turning her back to him made her stomach roil. Still, there was no getting around it. She turned on her heel and with a deep breath, started for the house. She listened carefully as she walked, her ears pricked for the sound of pursuit, but there was none. She reached the house in silence and returned to her bed, though sleep eluded her. Something was wrong and she was going to find out what it was, come what may. Chapter 6. In her desire to reach town and the sheriff's office quickly, Margaret set out with the dawn, leaving the dishes on their rack and her bed unmade. It had taken her days of sneaking around and spying, but finally she'd found the truth behind the worry that had plagued her for weeks. Randall was a thief. It had been the night before that Margaret had set her trap. She used the keen interest Randall had shown in her nightly repose to pretend she'd gone to bed early. Instead, she had hidden herself near the corral to lie in wait. As he had some nights before, Randall appeared at the corral cloaked by night, and proceeded to release one of the herd, just as she'd caught him before. This night, however, it was not to lead the heifer to the barn in quarantine, but to lead it toward the hills. Margaret had used all of her will to hold her tongue. The desire to announce his treachery immediately was almost uncontrollable, but she needed time to make her plans. She also needed the sheriff to witness this for himself, or it would be her word against Randall's. Margaret was no fool. She'd seen enough women belied as irrational or emotional when their husbands were absent, and they were left to themselves. As if women suddenly became fragile and ignorant because they were on their own. She would not bear such an accusation. She would get the sheriff to her ranch, and as she had done, he would see the truth for himself. Then Randall would pay for his rustling. What do you mean he ain't here? Margaret questioned the deputy. It's just like I said, Mrs. Palmer. Sheriff Hode and a few men went out after a bank robber. He was witnessed passing through town in the direction of Winston, the deputy stated with growing impatience. But I need him, Margaret protested. It don't make no difference. He ain't here, the man continued, his potbelly peeking out from beneath his shirt. Fine then, Margaret replied, fisting her hands on her waist. Can you help me then? Can't leave my post. Sweet Lord, must I deal with this matter myself? The thought was troubling, but far less troubling than the idea of Joseph returning home to a missing herd. She had to take matters into her own hands. She had no choice. The only person to defend the ranch was her. And she was going to have to make Randall leave, one way or another. It was chilly that night, and the thin layers of Margaret's coat did little to help shield her from the bite. Winter was weeks away, but already the atmosphere had begun to change, a nipping wind flowing in from nowhere to nip the skin and cause words to appear in clouds. Gripping her husband's rifle, she'd laid in wait for almost an hour, sure Randall would make an appearance, but so far he'd remained tucked inside the barn, warm and snug, while she froze outside. She was about ready to turn in, when the barn door slipped open and a shadowy figure stepped out. She ducked lower to watch. He moved like a cat hunting a mouse, keeping to the shadows and the far side of the house. He was clever, she had to give it to him, keeping track of when she slept and taking the cattle one at a time, hoping she wouldn't notice. Margaret had never counted the head that belonged to her husband's herd. That was something he saw to. She took care of other things, leaving the cattle and heavy lifting to the one with the arms for it. Now she'd wished she'd paid more attention. There was no telling how many things may have gone missing without her knowledge. Randall crept towards the corral, the cattle lowing softly as he pulled open the gate. Not yet, she told herself. She had to catch him red-handed. Margaret continued to watch as Randall led a steer out and then began to untie his horse so he could lead the animal away. It was now or never. She rushed forward with rifle in hand, the barrel trained on Randall's middle as she called to him. "Ya stop right there. Don't you dare move," she challenged with more bravery than she felt. Her hand was trembling, though she tried to hide it, and her breath was coming in hard pants. "What's this, Mrs. Palmer?" Randall protested. His mock surprise didn't fool her. She may have been fooled by a lot before now, but she'd already had her suspicions confirmed. The good Lord had been giving Margaret nudges for as long as she could remember, with that little knot in her stomach and the nagging feeling that never seemed to go away. She thought of them as God's alarm for her, which told her when something was amiss. When it had first started to happen years before, she'd ignored the sensations, but after the murder of her parents that night in Virginia, she'd learned never to ignore it again. Ignoring those subtle warnings had ruined her life, but God in His mercy had given her a new beginning, and she wasn't about to let anyone steal it. She raised the gun to Randall's chest. "Don't try any of your sweet talk on me, Randall. I know all about you stealing my husband's cattle, and I'm here to tell you that it ends now." "No, put that steer back and step away from the horse," she ordered, stepping closer. It was amazing what a gun could do. Normally, Margaret would have been terrified, but with a loaded weapon in her hands, she found herself oddly strong, as if she could take on the entire Nebraska regiment. Why couldn't she have had one of those when her parents were killed? "Now, Miss Margaret, why don't you put that gun down before you hurt someone?" Randall replied, his hands in the air even as he stepped towards her. "Stay right there," she yelled. His smile didn't fool her. She wasn't moving that gun for anything. "You saw me, didn't ya?" he asked, his tone changing from sweetness to something sinister. "When I took the steer the other night, you was watchin', Dot." "Yes, I was watchin'. I saw you steal it and ride off." Randall continued to close the gap between them, and with every step he took, Margaret's nerves became more frazzled. "I said stop. What you goin' to do? Shoot me?" he challenged, and when she hesitated, he continued. "I didn't think so." She pulled the hammer back. "Yes, I would," she lied and hoped it was convincing. Margaret had never lifted a gun in her life until now. Joseph had tried to teach her after they were married, but she'd refused. Every time she saw a gun, she saw the lifeless eyes of her parents gaping back at her. It was only because she had no other means of protecting herself that she'd even touched the rifle now. Her moment of hesitation, as the memory taunted her, was enough. Margaret didn't even see when Randall sprang towards her at a run, and in her surprise, the gun fired in the air, the recoil sending her sprawling to the ground. A moment later, Randall was on her, the gun being tugged from her hands as she struggled to keep her grip. "No," she yelled. "Give it here," he replied through gritted teeth, as they tussled for the weapon. If she gave it up, she was a dead woman, there was no doubt in her mind. Randall would kill her to keep her quiet. He had to shoot her, cattle rustling meant jail or worse. There was no way of telling what kind of criminal history he may have had. She was convinced this wasn't the first time he'd taken an animal. He was too precise in his planning for this to be a first offense. "Get off of me," she screamed. "Give me the gun." Her knee came up and connected with his crotch. Randall howled in pain and fell aside. Margaret momentarily felt the lifting of his weight from her, and a moment of hope grabbed her, as she tried to roll away. But her hope was short-lived. The second she moved, he grabbed her by the hair, yanking so hard that she screamed out in pain, sure he'd taken a handful from her scalp. She fell back. Her muscles tensed, ready to fight, then something heavy landed against her skull as a sudden flash of white blinded her. Then all was dark. Chapter 7. Joseph hadn't worked in days. He hadn't found an iota of gold in the time he'd been away. His stomach was tied up in knots, and he couldn't explain why. He spent most of the night either tossing and turning on his mat, or in a fitful sleep filled with strange dreams that only made him more troubled. A thought kept coming to him again and again. "Margaret needs you." Joseph tried to ignore it, but the more he did, the worse his stomach got. Finally, he made the decision to go home. He didn't bother to write Margaret, she'd see him soon enough. Right then all he could think of was the relief he'd feel once he laid eyes on her and knew she was all right. When the train arrived in Lawton City, Joseph didn't hesitate. He marched himself over to the saloon. There was no one to pick him up, but Robert Ferguson, his good friend, was sure to have a horse he could borrow. Once mounted, Joseph raced toward his homestead with every fiber of his being on fire. Something was definitely wrong, and whatever it was bad. He just knew it. The horse reared to a stop as Joseph yanked on the reins and jumped from its back. He bounded up the short steps of his home and flung the front door open. "Margaret." She didn't answer. He raced through the house, throwing doors open, but she was nowhere to be seen. He dashed outside to see if he could find her, but there was no sign of her in the field or in the barn. There was no one around, not even Randall. Where could she be? "Margaret," he yelled, each unanswered call filling him with more fear than he'd ever felt in his life. "Margaret." Nothing. Lord, where is she? He rounded the house, his legs taking him towards a thicket some yards from the corral. He wasn't sure why he was running in that direction, there was no reason for it, but something inside him told him he was going in the right direction. The back of the Palmer Ranch was marked by a steep ravine that was usually overgrown with bush for most of the year, but coming close to winter, the foliage dried up to reveal a rocky slope. He raced to the edge and gasped. "Margaret," he cried as he slid down the slope to her side. His wife was crumpled at the bottom, her face pale and her hair marred by dark blood that had also trickled down her cheek and stuck to her face and clothes. "Jesus, help me," he pleaded as he hoisted her limp body into his arms and cradled her head. She was cold, and a look of death was on her face as he tried feverishly to wrap her in the jacket he'd pulled from his own body. What had happened to her? How had she ended up there? Margaret knew about the ravine, she wouldn't have gone near it. "Speak to me," he cried. "Speak to me, Margaret." His demand was answered by a barely audible groan, but his wife remained otherwise still. He needed to get help and fast. The thought of losing her, the only woman who'd ever meant anything to him, was unbearable. He'd been a fool to leave her, a fool not to have come home sooner. "It's all right, Margaret, I'm goin' to take care of you. You're goin' to be fine. You hear me? You're goin' to be fine," he stated, as he pushed himself from the ground, her body cradled against his. The trek up the slope was precarious, and Joseph slipped more than once in the attempt, but finally, he reached the top. Immediately, he was running. Joseph laid Margaret in the back of the wagon before hitching the horses to it. He was barely cognizant of his surroundings, but the glimpse of his rifle in the grass caught his eye. He had no time to investigate, Margaret needed a doctor and quickly. Joseph burst into the doc's office with Margaret in his arms. "I need help." He was met by the alarmed eyes of the new doctor's assistant. "Doc Colby." "Doc Colby," she yelled as she jumped up from her seat. "What's the matter?" a thin speckled man replied, but the sight of Joseph was answer enough. "Get her in here." It took all he had not to push the doctor aside as he began to examine Margaret. Doc Colby had ordered him to stay back, but Joseph wanted to be near her. He wanted to hold her, to tell her all the things he had never dared tell her before. And why hadn't he? Because he was a fool. He loved her. He wanted her to be happy. He wanted a family. What if she died, and he never got to tell her? What if his silence meant she'd never know the depth of his love for her? Margaret had been an unexpected joy in his life. The first letter she wrote had captured him. The candid way she expressed herself was something he admired. He hadn't been raised to share his feelings. His father was a quiet man, just as he had become, and like him, talking about feelings was the last thing on his list of things to do. Margaret seemed to have enough to say for both of them. When she'd arrived, she'd filled his empty house with song. She loved to sing. Every day, it was something new, and he'd grown accustomed to it. Slowly, as the time passed and their friendship grew, his admiration had grown to affection and finally love, though he hadn't uttered a word about it. He was sure she didn't feel the same. He didn't consider himself especially easy to love. She'd only come to him because of the pressure from her extended family. They didn't need another mouth to feed with her parents dead and the war raging. He'd convinced himself that she couldn't love him, a man as opposite to her as day was from night. There were times when she'd look at him, and he'd hope that maybe one day she might love him, before convincing himself again that it was asking too much of God to allow love to blossom between them, even if they were man and wife. "She's gotta be all right, Doc," he pleaded. "Lord, she has to be all right. Please give me the chance to tell her I love her." Chapter 8. Margaret struggled awake. The light hurt her head, and her nausea seemed never-ending. It had been days since she'd found herself back in her own bed with the worst pain she'd ever felt. If that wasn't bad enough, the persistent drowsiness and nausea made being awake almost unbearable. She'd spent most of the time asleep since then. Doc Colby had been concerned the first few days. Her mind was so confused she hardly recognized anyone, especially after she'd first awakened. She'd even had trouble recognizing Joseph, but fortunately, that had passed. Margaret couldn't explain what she felt when she saw Joseph standing over her. It was as if her every prayer had been answered, and God had miraculously brought him home. Hearing the story of what had prompted his return, Margaret had no doubt that it was God. Her father had called her husband home just in time. Doc Colby said if she'd been without treatment much longer, she wouldn't have made it. Neither would their baby. Her hands moved to her stomach. She held the strangest love in her heart for a little person she couldn't even see or feel. But it was true, they were having a child. The news was both exciting and intimidating. Margaret had always wanted a large family, and the thought of it had crossed her mind frequently since marrying Joseph. She prayed her loved her, as a man should love his wife, but she was never sure. She'd fallen in love with him the more she got to know him, but he'd never let her see into his heart. "Good mornin'," his smoky voice called as he stepped into the room. He was dressed in his work clothes, despite the fact that the herd was gone. Randall was now a wanted man, and the sheriff and a party of men were looking for him, not only for rustling, but for attempted murder. Margaret still couldn't believe he'd tried to kill her to keep his secret from being discovered. Randall, as they knew him, was actual Barton Jinks, a wanted cattle rustler and armed robber. He'd been traveling under an assumed name, one the sheriff believed might have been stolen from a man who was found dead 2 states over. "Good mornin', Dot." Her voice was still scratchy from lack of use and dryness. The doctor had warned her about dehydration with her persistent sleeping spells, and she really was doing her best to get her fluids, but sometimes it was difficult. A large basin of water was in his hands, steam curling from the brim. "I brought your bath water," Joseph announced. Margaret nodded her thanks. Joseph was a better nurse than she'd imagined. He cooked for her, bathed her, and dressed her. The doctor had ordered her to stay in bed and rest as much as possible. He said her brain was a fragile thing and would be so for some weeks yet, but he held no fear of there being any permanent damage. Joseph was so strong and handsome, as if the weeks he'd been gone had somehow enhanced his features and the strength of his arms. She was probably being silly, but no one had ever looked as good as he did right then. He made her heart sing. She'd truly come to love him deeply, this reserved brute of a man who had the sweetest smile and the most captivating eyes. Why couldn't he see her? Why couldn't he truly love her? Especially now, when they were expecting a child. "How ya feelin' today?" he asked, setting the basin on the table near their bed. They had an old metal box spring, but Joseph had promised that once he'd found gold, he'd get her something nicer. "I'm fine," she said, trying to sit up. "Keep still. No need to be movin' 'bout," he said and placed a hand on her belly. "Both of you need your rest." Joseph wasn't a man who smiled often. Most of the time, he gave a minuscule smirk and a nod as a sign of his happiness. Not now. He was glowing. Ever since Doc Colby had made the announcement that she was expecting, Joseph seemed to smile every time he looked at her. "All I do is rest," she complained. "I'm now finally able to keep my eyes open for more than a few minutes at a time. I want to do more." "Doc said you're to stay put for a few more weeks yet. No heavy lifting. You leave all that to me." He sighed, drawing his chair closer. "I'm going to take really good care of you both. I won't let anything happen to you ever again." "Joe," she said, raising a hand to his cheek. "It's not your fault." "Yes, it is. I left you here with that man." Margaret watched as Joseph's knuckles went white, and his jaw clenched under the strain of his anger. Nothing she said seemed to work. He blamed himself for what had happened to her, and for what had almost happened to both her and the baby. "If I'd lost you," he began, but couldn't finish. "Point is that you didn't, Joe." She squeezed his hand. "There's grace in that. God didn't allow it. He called you back home. He kept me alive until you returned. Surely, you can see a reason to give thanks in that." "Course I do. I thank him every day," Joseph assured her, leaning closer as he grasped her hand in his. "You mean so much to me, Margaret." Her heart paused. She watched the lump bob in his throat. "I love ya, Margaret," he blurted. "I've never loved anyone like this. I didn't realize it until I was apart from ya, and when it seemed you were happy to be apart from me." "I was never happy apart from you," she stated emphatically, her heart in her throat. "Never. I didn't want you to go, but you wanted to go so badly that I didn't feel I had the right to ask you to stay. I thought. You could have asked me anything. Anything at all," he assured. "Whatever you asked, I'd do, Margaret. Surely you knew that?" She looked into his eyes, her heart so light that she felt as if she'd float away. "I thought it was just friendship between us," she murmured. "I didn't think you felt for me the way I feel for ya." "What are you saying?" She smiled, leaning back as another bout of fatigue claimed her. "I love you, too, Joseph Palmer. I love you." Chapter 9. "Keep your head," Sheriff Hode warned Joseph for the third time since they'd headed out. Word had come to the sheriff from a neighboring county that Randall was in the area at a cattle auction. The sheriff had come to inform Joseph right away. He'd gathered a small posse of men to get Randall and drag him back to Lawton to see justice served. Joseph had immediately wanted to join them. He wanted to be there when they caught the man who had harmed his wife, but it was the thought of her that had stopped him. If he hadn't left Margaret in the first place, none of this would have happened. How could he leave her now when she needed him? Go. That's what she told him. Unlike the first time she'd told him to leave her, this was different. Margaret understood why he had to be there to get Randall. Why he wanted to be the one to catch him. Joseph was her covering, her protection. The person he had trusted to stand in his place while he tried to provide for her, had betrayed him. It was personal. Not revenge, but justice he was seeking. Though Sheriff Hode was more than capable, along with the men with him, Joseph wouldn't have felt satisfied leaving it in their hands. He'd watched Margaret every day for the past 2 weeks as she struggled to survive, and she still wasn't in the clear. How would he live with himself if he didn't try to bring the man responsible to justice? How would he feel if the sheriff went and Randall slipped through their fingers? No. He couldn't let that happen. He had to be there. He had to be part of bringing Randall to justice, and his wife understood. Her approval and her blessing were all he needed. Did you hear me, Joseph? Keep your head. We're going to catch him. The sheriff's words were barely audible over the thunder of hoofbeats. I heard ya. Joseph shouted back, the wind whipping his face cruelly as they raced across the plain. You better. I don't want to have to be locking you up for his murder, instead of the other way round, Sheriff Hode warned. Don't you worry about me, Hode. I want to see him rot fair what he did. I ain't depriving anyone of justice. It ain't for me to dole it out. Neither is revenge. Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. The words echoed in his mind, but anger filled his heart, as images of Margaret, pale and bleeding, flashed before his eyes. The pain Randall had caused and what had nearly happened, were enough to make his blood boil. Keep your head, Joseph, he cautioned himself. He had never been a man prone to anger. He prided himself on being level-headed and fair, but he'd never been in such a position. He'd never had someone harm someone he loved, especially someone he loved as much as Margaret. The fact was, Joseph wasn't sure what he'd do when he saw Randall again, but he was about to find out. Chesterton was 30 miles from Lawton, a bustling trade town that saw all of its money come in from the visitors who populated its streets for the monthly auctions. There wasn't a thing that the traders in Chesterton wouldn't trade. Joseph believed if they could have traded people, they would have, which was why Randall's destination hadn't been a surprise to Joseph when Sheriff Hode had announced it. There was very little good to be spoken of there. Chesterton was just the place where vermin like Randall would hide. He'd be amongst his own. We got to be strategic about this, Sheriff Hode cautioned as he and the men he'd gathered rested on the outskirts of town. They didn't want to alarm Randall by arriving all at once and frightening him away, or worse yet, causing him to fight. They wanted as peaceful an arrest as possible, especially since they couldn't predict who may have joined him since his arrival in Chesterton. The situation was as precarious to them as it was to him. We know he's going to be trying to trade Joseph's herd, and I learned that the auction started at noon, an hour ago. So he's got to be round here somewhere. We just have to find him before he leaves. So keep a low profile and keep your eyes out for him. He may be anywhere. Last thing we want is him running like the scared rabbit he is, or trying to strike before we do. The sheriff's eyes were trained on Joseph. We don't want no bloodshed if it can be helped. Agreed. Agreed, Joseph confirmed. He didn't want anyone getting hurt. He just wanted justice, and to return to his family. The auction was loud. The sound of voices clamoring was almost overwhelming, and coupled with the sounds of the animals up for sale, it was deafening. Joseph wasn't used to such racket, and it was a reminder of why he'd stayed far from town on his homestead for all his life. He liked the quiet. You look over there, Dalton Cope said. The man was around his age, wiry and fair-haired. He was Hode's second deputy, and from what Joseph had heard, the man who'd probably be the next sheriff when Hode hung up his badge, whenever that may be. You sure? Joseph questioned seriously. I trust you ain't going to do nothing stupid, Palmer, Dalton warned, with a hand on his hip near his gun. 'Cause I'd arrest you just as easily as I would him. You don't have to worry about me. I just think 4 eyes are better than 2 is all. This way we cover more ground and are less conspicuous. This guy's real slick. He's been running this game fair years, and no one's caught him. I aim to be the one who brings his scheming hide to justice, Dalton asserted. Joseph nodded and turned in the direction he'd been instructed. If Dalton wanted to be known as the man who caught Randall, that was fine by him, as long as he was caught. The smell of animals and damp earth filled the air as Joseph stalked the perimeter around the auction. Everyone's eyes were on the corrals, their attention between the steers and those selling them. Hats hung low over eyes and stubble marked the chins of those who had come a long way to the sale. There were some prize animals on display, most of them probably stolen, Joseph thought as he watched the looks of the men standing by. They all seemed shady. How was he supposed to find Randall in all of this? Joseph lowered his eyes, trying to keep his observations as inconspicuous as possible, though he wasn't sure anyone would have noticed him. He looked like most of the men there, dirty and sweaty from a long ride. Randall wouldn't look so rough though, it occurred to him. He'd been there a while, selling off cattle. He'd probably have a place to stay, which meant he should look pretty good compared to the rest of them. Where was he? Joseph's frustration was building. After half an hour of looking, he hadn't found a sign of Randall and no one else seemed to have either. Had they missed him? Had the weasel managed to slip through another net? One more pass. He'd look one more time before going back to the rendezvous point to see if anyone else had better luck. He had to find him. Someone had to find him. The sun was beginning to set and a cool breeze wafted through the auction, sending the animal stench a mile high. Then he saw it, his mark on one of the cattle. He'd nearly missed it, but something inside had told him to look again. He walked toward the corral for a better look. There, on the animal's rear, was his brand. His senses heightened. If his animals were there, then Randall had to be close by. His eyes scanned the crowd frantically. The last thing he wanted was to be spotted by Randall before he spotted him. Suddenly, it was as if the men before him parted and there he was. Randall. He was dressed in black and gray, a scarf around his neck and a hat over his eyes. He was talking to a man, probably a buyer looking to purchase some of Joseph's cattle. Joseph's hands balled into fists. He'd worked hard to get the small herd he had, and he'd done what he had to in order to get the money to add to it. Now this good-for-nothing was selling off what little he had, nearly killing his wife in the process. He walked toward him, his eyes fixed on Randall as if his look alone would prevent him from running away as Joseph approached. He was almost to him when Randall turned and their eyes locked. Joseph stopped, and they stared at one another. Then Randall started to run. Adrenaline coursed through Joseph's veins in an instant, and his legs sprang into action as he sped after Randall, his anger rising with every step. People were knocked out of the way as Randall tried to escape. Joseph had to jump over one or two of them that fell across his path, but he wasn't giving up. The commotion of his pursuit soon had others from the posse running after him as they called for Randall to stop. Joseph didn't speak, his entire focus was on closing the gap between him and Randall. Energy he didn't know he possessed filled his legs, and then he was upon Randall, his hands reaching out to grab the collar of his neck as he yanked him back with a growl. Randall fell and Joseph followed him with a raised fist, and for the first time in Joseph's life, he saw red. Chapter 10. It had been days since Joseph left, and in that time Margaret had continued to heal. Her fatigue had lessened, as well as her sensitivity to light, but the dizziness and nausea still plagued her from time to time. Doc Colby assured that everything was as it should be. "Everything will be just fine," Margaret, Daisy, a friendly woman from town, said as she handed her a mug of tea. Doc said so, she assured her. Daisy's presence had been a godsend to Margaret. Her husband Robert had gone off with Joseph after Randall, and Daisy had offered to keep watch over her while the men were away. She was so positive, and the time Daisy took to pray with her daily had done a great deal to calm Margaret's anxiety. Still, Margaret wanted Joseph home. She wanted him with her. "Aren't you scared at all, Daisy?" she questioned as she sipped her tea. Daisy paused to sip from her own mug before answering. "Course I am. Fear is natural, but we have to trust in God more than we fear. We need to remember that He's in control. He worked all this out for ya. He kept you here. He's given ya a baby," she mused. "And now He's going to see to it that the man who tried to hurt you gets caught. I'm sure of it. I'm not concerned about that. I'm concerned about Joe. I'm afraid of what he'll do if he catches him." Daisy looked at her sympathetically. "There's nothing you can do about it now, Margaret. God will see to Joseph. He did it fair the one in the Bible, He can surely do it fair your husband. Margaret chuckled. My Joseph's less of a talker than that one. And that's what concerns ya. You think he's held in his anger all this time, and he might let it out if he catches Randall? Margaret nodded. I've never seen Joe angry. Not once. He has to feel it, but he doesn't express it. It can't be good to never get all your feelings out. How long can a person hold it all in before they can't anymore? I don't know. I wish I could tell ya. Daisy paused. I will say this. I've never met a man who is so level-headed. I'm sure that even under these circumstances, he'll be able to weather his emotions. He's got you and your little one to think about. He won't do nothing stupid. If you can trust in anything, trust in that. Joseph loves ya. He may not be the best at saying it, but his actions have always told me so, and now he's finally said it himself. He won't jeopardize that. Daisy patted Margaret's hand gently. He'll come home, and everything will be fine. Another day passed, and still, there was no word from Joseph or the posse. Margaret wasn't sleeping, and her nights were spent in prayer asking for God's mercy on all of them. Margaret? Daisy said early one morning. Margaret struggled to respond. She was weary from the hours of prayer, the sun rising on her petitions so often that she found herself waking late some mornings. She wanted to tell Daisy to come back later, that she wasn't hungry or whatever else Daisy may have wanted. She just needed to sleep. Not now, Margaret mumbled, unable to form anything more coherent. She heard the shuffle of feet and the sound of the door closing. She had already begun to slip beneath the weight of sleep once more when another voice spoke. Margaret? A gentle hand touched her shoulder. Still, she struggled to come out from the cloud of sleep. It was warm, comforting and better than the reality that Joseph had yet to return. Margaret? Wake up. Was she dreaming? The urging voice was smoky, alluring in its call, and familiar. But Joseph wasn't there. He was still away. Joe? She groaned, resisting the urge to wake. I'm home. Her eyes flew open immediately. There, standing before her, covered in the dust of the road and sweat dampening his brow, was Joseph. Joe? She said softly, almost unable to believe her eyes. You're home. I'm home, he repeated, taking a seat beside her on the bed. She looked at him, all the while thanking God in her heart for returning him safely. He looked wonderful, or was that just the relief she felt? Did you get him? We got him, Joseph confirmed and rested a hand on top of hers. He won't be hurting anyone else. A stab of panic gripped Margaret's heart, every fear she'd imagined coming to mind. Joe, you didn't, she started, but was unable to finish. Didn't what, Margaret? You didn't hurt him, did you? Joseph didn't respond. Joe? Margaret questioned, pushing up on her elbows until she was sitting up, Joseph helping her the last of the way. No, I didn't, but I wanted to. I nearly did, he admitted. She was relieved to hear that he hadn't harmed Randall. Margaret knew that if he had, the fact would have destroyed him. What happened? Joseph exhaled deeply as Margaret waited for his response. I found him in Chesterton. He was selling off our cattle, and almost half the herd was gone when I found him. When he spotted me, he ran, and I ran after him. He scooted closer and held her hand tighter. Go on. When I got my hands on him, I wanted to hurt him, Joseph admitted. I wanted to hurt him for what he'd done, and what he nearly did. His hand reached over to her face, the rough calluses caressing her cheek, their gentle touch comforting. It assured her that he was really there. I hit him, Joseph continued. I hit him, and I kept hitting him. His brow furrowed. Then I saw you before my eyes. I heard your voice in my head telling me that God was a righteous judge, and he was the only one who had the right to dole out punishment. He stared into her eyes. Those words stopped me from doing something I couldn't live with. Something God knew I wouldn't have been able to let go of. He knows you better than you do, she murmured. He knows your heart. He does, he whispered. But I was so angry, Margaret. I wanted to hurt him for hurting you. He almost took you from me. I'm here, she gently reassured him. I never want to be away from you again. I don't care what it is, he said. I'm not leaving you again. God gave you to me, and I'm going to take care of my family. You and our baby. He rested his hand on her belly, and Margaret placed her hand over his. Their fingers crossed over one another as they both looked at the place where a new life was coming into being. I love you, Joe, she whispered, her eyes still on her stomach. I love you, and I'm glad you're home. We're glad you're home. I prayed every day that God would bring you back safely. He answered my prayers. She raised her eyes to his, and for the first time since they'd exchanged vows, she leaned in and kissed him first. Joseph's arms wound around her, pulling her closer. She surrendered into his arms. Her life was entwined with his, two people completely one in body and in spirit, and a new life to prove it. The reality brought tears to Margaret's eyes. Margaret? Joseph questioned when her dampening cheeks alerted him. You're crying, Dot. I'm happy, she said with a sniffle. She could see in his eyes that he didn't understand. She tried to compose herself enough to explain. It's okay, he said soothingly. She nodded. It's better than okay. Ever since my family was killed, I've wanted a family to belong to. When I married you, I thought I'd be happy with just having a roof over my head and a kind man to look after me, but I found so much more, she explained. Being with you made me hope again. Learning more about God with you made me think that maybe he could make us into a real family. That he could make love grow from companionship. She smiled. And he did. Joseph continued to stroke Margaret's back as she sucked in a jagged breath. He's given me more than I'd hoped for, she said finally, and she hugged him tightly. It weren't just you, Joseph replied, once again pulling her close and holding her against his chest. I wanted it, too, but I was afraid to ask. Afraid that I'd asked him for too much in prayin' for ya, but I've learned that we never ask God enough, and there ain't nothin' he'd withhold. No, not a thing. You're everything I could have asked for, Joseph told her, his voice thick. And for the rest of my life, I'm goin' to be the man you need, and be in the place where God wants me to be, right beside you. I want that for the rest of my life, too. I want that. She looked into his eyes. I don't want less than all of you, Joe. I want to give all that I am to you in this marriage, as God wants. I want to do this together, to build with ya and learn with ya. I don't want us to be apart. Never again, he whispered, caressing her cheek. From this day forth, I vow to ya, Margaret Palmer, that our days will be crafted together. That no one can put asunder what the Lord has put together. You're the other part of me, and I won't let you go. She smiled. Neither will I. We'll walk this road together with all our little babies. She gave a happy laugh as she thought of their child. Joseph brought his lips to meet hers. It had taken more than a year, but God had made the two into one, and no longer would their paths diverge. They would remain one, as he intended, and Margaret was well content with the thought. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.